Are you sure you got everything? Her father asked for probably the 10th time in just as many minutes. Yes, father, I'm sure I got everything, Cersei replied, knowing all too well that all she could do in this situation to reassure her father was to reply as confidently as she could. Which wasn't too hard, considering that she had checked her luggage twice and her father had checked an additional 3 times. But she also knew that her father wouldn't stop worrying until she had safely returned from her trip. Anybody else? Would have been annoyed by her father's behavior, but she just couldn't bring herself to be annoyed by him. Because she acted pretty much the same way every time her parents went to another realm for any amount of time. It was just one of the ways she and her parents showed that they loved one another. Additionally, this wasn't just any old realm that she would be visiting, but a completely unexplored one, and in such a realm anything could happen to her. Which made it more than understandable why her father was so worried about the idea of her going there. All of that being said, though, she couldn't deny that she was looking forward to not being asked the same question over and over again, because all that really did was make her even more nervous about her first exploration mission than she already was. Thankfully, she didn't have to wait too long for that to happen, because the arrival of her mother and grandmother pretty much forced her father to shift his attention from her to his mother, who was currently glaring at him like only a disappointed mother could, while nodding towards the pile of vials she was carrying. When Cersei's father simply continued to stare at her, she sighed and said, "Don't just stand there, boy, help us." That actually made her father flinch a little before he hurried towards the 2 women and took half of the vials each of them were carrying. This seemed to somewhat satisfy his mother, but not enough to stop her from saying, "Why did it take you so long to get that? I raised you better than that." "Sorry, mother, I'm just," was all Cersei's father managed to say as he walked towards a table, before he was interrupted by his mother. "Worried about your daughter. Trust me, boy, I know, and if I recall correctly, your father acted the same way when you traveled to another realm for the first time. So I suppose you take more after your father than your mother," she said while nudging her son. That got a laugh out of Cersei's father, before a mischievous smile spread across his face, and he said, "Yes, I do remember that quite well, but I also still remember the bear hug you gave me after I returned, and that you had refused to leave the room until I returned." "Fair enough," was all his mother said as she put the vials onto a table. "Anyway, you 2 set up the gate spell while I check on our little explorer." Cersei's parents simply nodded in response, but her grandmother didn't see that because she had already turned towards Cersei to walk over to her. Once she stood in front of her granddaughter, she gave her a once-over, before she said, "Now tell me, Cersei, what are you supposed to do when you have gone through that gate?" Cersei had expected to be asked something like that, and so had come prepared. "Upon arriving on the other side of the gate, my first task is to survey the area surrounding the gate for any immediate dangers, and once I have confirmed that no dangers are present, I'm supposed to gather basic information about the realm, like how high the mana concentration in the air is. After that, the next task is to collect some samples of the local plant life for research purposes, and once I have collected enough, I'm supposed to find a good vantage point, or if none are available, use a levitation spell to locate the closest village, town, or city. But under no circumstances should I approach any settlements or the inhabitants of the realm, both because that is not my mission, and I lack the diplomatic training to handle a first contact scenario. Once I have done all that, my mission will be completed, and I can return home by using the gatestone to locate it, because it will be invisible and will only let someone who is carrying a gatestone through. However, if the gate leads into the middle of a settlement, then my only task is to quickly survey the surrounding area around the gate, and then immediately return without being seen by any of the inhabitants if possible. If the gate, however, drops me somewhere where I get immediately spotted by the inhabitants, or I get spotted by them while surveying the area, then I'm supposed to use the memory crystal to make them forget the entire thing, and then return immediately." Once she had finished her explanation, her grandmother gave her a satisfied nod but also said, "Yes, that is what you are supposed to do, and nothing more. Is that understood?" Cersei simply nodded firmly, because thanks to her father reminding her, more than enough times over the last few minutes, that curiosity was one of the main reasons why people died on these kinds of missions. With overconfidence, the slow and insidious killer that it was being another, for her to understand why she should just do her job and then get out of there. Seemingly satisfied, her grandmother nodded as well, before she leaned forward with a mischievous, smile on her face and said, "Good, but are you really sure that you got everything, dear?" Cersei simply smiled at her and replied as confidently as possible, "Yes, I'm very sure." Her grandmother only petted her head in response before she turned around and walked back towards Cersei's parents, waving for Cersei to follow her. Once she and her grandmother were standing next to them, they could see that the spell circle wasn't finished just yet. This left Cersei with little else to do than imagining what the realm she would soon be visiting would be like, because the alternative was either to watch her parents work on the spell circle or look around what had at some point probably been the windowless living quarters of two of her house's servants, judging by the size of the room, which only had a simple wooden table inside of it. She knew, of course, that no realm could live up to what her imagination could come up with, and that whilst the gods could make anything they desired, they had to make their creations as strong as the balance allowed to dissuade the other gods from invading their realm, because if one of the gods lost all of their followers, they would slowly become weaker and weaker until they either just stopped existing entirely or were put out of their misery by one of the other gods. Which was why most of the gods stuck to giving their own little twist to the tried and tested creations of their relatives or allies, which led to a surprising amount of uniformity among the known realms and to many disappointed explorers. But even though she knew all of that, it didn't manage to dampen her excitement even a little bit, because at the end of the day, she would soon set foot onto a realm that had remained undiscovered for a few thousand years at the very least, because of how ridiculously far from all the other known realms it was, and that meant that it was quite possible that this realm, as well as its inhabitants, was as old or even older than even the oldest known realms. Which also meant that there was a very good chance that the god or goddess of that realm had broken the mold when making their creations. But the question is, how did they break the mold? Are all of the animals, plants, and even the inhabitants made out of pure crystals? No. I can already tell that a race like that would be way too powerful, because they are literally made out of a material that is famous for being the best mana conduit in existence, and no weakness would be able to balance that out. However, the crystalline plants and animals should still be possible. The animals, however, would probably be rather rare, because of how dangerous they would be to the inhabitants of the realm, and not to mention how unhuggable they would be. Unless the inhabitants had a way to either keep them at bay or avoid them entirely. All things considered, their best option would probably be to avoid them, because animals with a high mana capacity tend to grow much larger than animals with a low mana capacity, and that would probably make them, at least physically, as powerful as some dragons. But how do you avoid an animal that could be the size of a house or even larger? I guess they could build their settlements in the crowns of the crystalline trees, because they should grow big enough thanks to being made out of crystal, or if the trees don't grow big enough, they could simply live underground. However, the inhabitants would have to be as small or maybe even smaller than the Dawi to employ either of these strategies effectively, and that would also make them physically weaker than other races, unless their god or goddess had done something to make them physically stronger. Which is somewhat unlikely because most the gods tend to like their creations to be magically gifted instead of physically strong, and said physical weakness is additionally also a good way to balance very magically gifted races, which the inhabitants would have to be if their creator doesn't want them to be immediately wiped out after being discovered by the other gods or eaten by the animals. But in that case, they could also give the inhabitants the ability to fly, because it would increase their survivability by quite a lot at the cost of some height as well as some more physical strength to make them light enough, and that way they... Okay, it's ready. Cersei had been so deep in thought that those few words from her father managed to startle her enough to make her let out a short eep. Thankfully, her family members had either not heard it or were nice enough to pretend they didn't hear anything, and after taking a moment to gather herself, Cersei turned towards the spell circle as casually as she could manage. Her parents had meanwhile taken their position on the antipodal sides of the spell circle and had begun chanting the incantation for the gate spell, while her grandmother kept an eye out for even the slightest sign of a complication. Thankfully, nothing went wrong, and after a minute or two, the spell circle started glowing, which soon grew in intensity until neither the spell circle nor the floor inside the circle were visible anymore, and then a simple wooden door began to emerge from the middle of the spell circle. Once it had fully emerged from the light, the glowing stopped and Cersei's grandmother stepped towards the door, She then pulled the enchanted monocle from somewhere inside the simple black robes that she as well as Cersei's parents were wearing and began to walk around the door, using the monocle to check if it was safe to use the gate. Once she had confirmed that the gate was safe to use, she put away the monocle and then nodded to Cersei. Cersei took a deep breath and then walked as confidently as she could towards the door. However, she grew ever more nervous the closer she got to the door, as her mind kept coming up with ever new nightmare scenarios. She of course tried to hide these emotions from her parents, because she didn't want them to worry even more than they already did. But that was somewhat difficult to do when your slightly glowing hair changes colors depending on your emotions, which was one of the weaknesses Sogeia, the elven god of magic, had given her race, so that they could be one of the most magically gifted, if not the most magically gifted race in all of the known realms. Thankfully, Cersei could reduce this color change by suppressing her nervousness, which was of course easier said than done. In fact, it took so much of her attention that she only noticed that her grandmother had walked towards her when she put her hand onto Cersei's shoulder. Cersei only barely managed to stop herself from letting out another eep, and after taking a deep breath to calm herself, she turned to look up at her grandmother, who only said, "You got this," with a reassuring smile on her face, and Cersei only had to look into her eyes to know that she really believed that she could do this. This, in the grand scheme of things, small gesture was more than enough to silence the doubtful voice in the back of Cersei's head and put a smile on her face that reached her eyes. After seeing that her grandmother let go of her shoulder and then nudged her ever so slightly towards the door, which was all the encouragement Cersei needed to take those last few steps towards the door. Once she was in front of the door, she grabbed the doorknob. She then closed her eyes before opening the door and stepping through. One would think that when you stepped through a gate to another realm, that it would be accompanied by something like a brief feeling of weightlessness, or of being pulled forward. But the only thing that happened while she passed through the gate was that she could have sworn that she tasted the color purple for just a moment before she reached the other side of the gate, and it disappeared as quickly as it had come. She then waited until she heard the door close itself behind her before she opened her eyes. To say that she was disappointed by what she saw would be an understatement, because instead of finding herself in a nice forest far away from any big settlements that she could explore to her heart's content for a few hours, she found herself in an alleyway in the middle of probably one of the biggest settlements in the realm, judging by the quality of the architecture, which was why Cersei threw her head back and groaned up at the sky before she said, "All I wanted was an easy and relaxing first mission, but no, apparently that's too much to ask for." She would have complained a bit more if her attention had not been drawn to the sky. Is it just me? Or is there something wrong with the sky? What exactly? Though, I mean, sure, it's a weird color and doesn't have the mana fireworks that the majority of the realms have. But the color of the sky usually depends on the preferences of whatever god or goddess that created the realm, and there can be no mana fireworks if there is not enough mana in the air. So neither of these things is really so weird that it could be called it wrong. But then why do I still feel... She shook her head in an attempt to pull herself out of her contemplations. "No, stop it, you got a job to do, and you can contemplate this when you're back home." With her mind now back on track, she took a look around the alleyway. It was empty, except for a few weird rectangular-shaped containers that had little wheels on the bottom and were, as far as she could tell, made out of metal. But there were also some containers that were cylinder-shaped without the wheels and way smaller. They had one thing in common, though, and that was that they were both filled with garbage, judging by how bad the closest one to her smelled. None of this seemed off to her, but she still couldn't shake the feeling that something about this realm was wrong. However, that was quickly shoved aside when Cersei noticed that she was only a few meters away from the entrance to the dead-end alley she was currently in, which of course led to a busy street, while she was right out in the open without any cover whatsoever, which of course caused her to panic and quickly run towards the nearest of the rectangular-shaped container. Thankfully, these containers were more than big enough for her to easily hide behind them without her having to crouch down. Once she reached it, she pressed herself against it, and then spent 1 or 2 minutes just taking deep breaths in an attempt to calm herself down. After her heart rate had slowed down, she carefully snuck towards the corner of the container, before she then even more carefully peered around the corner. Fortunately, it seemed that she had remained undiscovered, because there were currently no inhabitants standing at the entrance of the alleyway that were currently looking right at her or even at the general direction of the alleyway for that matter, which should have made her feel relieved. But from the moment she had really looked at the inhabitants, she had been unable to feel anything other than the same feeling of wrongness she had felt when she had looked at the sky. However, this time, it was blindingly obvious why she felt that way, and that was because the inhabitants looked like phantoms. That was really the only way Circe could describe these creatures that had the rough shape of a person, but without any arms or legs, and that were seemingly made out of pure darkness. Additionally, they didn't have any facial features, except for 2 white spots that appeared to be their eyes. In short, they were unlike any race Circe had ever heard of, imaginary or not, and that was exactly why she was so fascinated by them. Which was why she spent a good minute or two just watching the inhabitants as they floated by the entrance to the alleyway and ignored the slowly growing headache she got after a while. But the longer she looked at them, the more unfocused her vision seemed to become. Yet for some reason, she just couldn't bring herself to look away, and when she tried to move her head, she found that she couldn't move it, or the rest of her body for that matter, which once more caused her to panic and try to get her body to move back behind the container with all her might. But no matter how hard she tried, her body just wouldn't move. Because of that, she had no choice but to stare at the inhabitants for another minute or two while her headache grew ever worse before she could move again, and as a result of regaining control of her body so suddenly, she pulled her head so quickly back behind the container that she nearly got whiplash. Because of that, she spent another few minutes massaging her neck and temples in an attempt to make the pain in both go away. Thankfully, that actually worked, and once the pain was gone, Circe had to push all the questions she had right now into the back of her mind once more, so that she could focus on the task given to her by her grandmother, which was why she pulled the gate stone out of her bag while muttering, "Okay, I've surveyed the area around the gate, so all that's left is to return home without being seen," before she peeked once more around the corner of the container to check if it was safe enough to make a run for the door. However, as soon as her eyes fell onto the inhabitants again, she froze from sheer disbelief, because the inhabitants had changed. Instead of looking like limbless phantoms, they now looked like what could only be described as people made of pure darkness, who wore weird clothing which was quality-wise easily on par with what Circe had seen some high-ranking merchants wear, and who often held some sort of little rectangular magic tool whose purpose she could only guess at, either in their hands or where their ears would have been. However, because of the entire being made of darkness thing, it was impossible to make out any more than that. Overall, though, they looked a lot more normal than before, though that was a rather low bar to clear, thanks to this sudden change in appearance. Yet despite that, Circe couldn't shake the feeling that there was something terribly wrong with these people, besides the being made out of pure darkness thing, of course. However, that only made it better in Circle's eyes, because this was exactly why she had become an explorer in the first place, to discover new and strange things, just like most of the great explorers of her family. After all, her family was well known for their curiosity, and it was exactly this curiosity that pushed all thoughts of returning home from her mind, because she knew that this was her once-in-a-lifetime chance to study a new race firsthand. So, she put the gatestone back into her bag, and then simply continued to observe the inhabitants from her hiding spot. However, even after a little more than 20 minutes of simply staring at the passing crowd, all that she had learned was that the inhabitants' fashion sense was a lot more diverse than that of any other of the known races, and that the weird rectangular magic tools were far more common than it had at first appeared. However, that was to be expected. After all, one could only learn so much about a civilization by just watching their citizens for such a short time, and deep down, Circe knew this. But that was all right with her, because at the end of the day, she would still be the first to discover this information, which would earn her a spot in the history books for sure. But the longer she kept staring at the inhabitants, the louder a voice in the back of her head that told her to get closer to them seemed to become, and after a while of listening to it, the more she wanted to know what would happen if she did. So she looked for another hiding spot that was closer to the entrance of the alley and found one right in front of it. It wasn't the best hiding spot, but at this moment, Circe didn't really care because all she wanted was to know what would happen if she got even closer. So she waited for an opportunity to move, and when it came, she took it, running as quietly as she could towards one of the small garbage containers at the entrance of the alleyway. But just when she was about to reach it, the headache returned with a vengeance, causing her to trip and fall down rather painfully right in front of the alleyway entrance. She didn't really care about that at the moment, though, because the headache was just so bad that she almost believed a volcano had erupted inside her head. She didn't know how long she just lay there on the ground, holding her head and screaming in pain. But after what felt like an eternity to her, the pain finally began to stop. And as it did, she slowly began to hear the sound of voices around her, making her break out in a cold sweat as she realized how badly she had fucked up. She racked her brain trying to come up with a plan to salvage this situation, but couldn't come up with anything better than to just stand up as steadily as she could, then bow deeply, before turning around and running towards the portal as quickly as she could to get the hell out of there. With no better ideas coming to mind, she decided to just do that. But when she got up and looked around, she froze once more, because the inhabitants that were now surrounding her had changed once more. The darkness that they had once seemed to be made out of had disappeared, revealing that they looked a lot like elves, just far broader build, and with round ears instead of pointy ears, not to mention the height difference. Now, Circe wasn't tall, even by high elf standards, a compromise her creator, the father of all the elven gods, had to make to give them the magic talents that were the reason why they were seen as higher than their cousins. But the inhabitants were so tall in comparison that even one of their women had to get down on one knee to get close to eye level with her, something that Circe quickly wished she hadn't done, because it made it impossible for her to ignore the pitch-black energy that pulsed through her veins where Mana should have been, which turned what had once probably been normal eyes into two pitch-black orbs that still somehow managed to stare directly into her soul and her hair into a writhing mass of pure, condensed darkness. Which somewhat explained the headaches. They were caused by her magic senses trying to make sense out of what they were seeing, and only now had they succeeded. However, despite that, she could only see the energy, not feel it, which only strengthened the feeling of pure wrongness and emptiness the inhabitants seemed to radiate. This feeling, coupled with their appearance, quickly made Circe afraid of them, causing her to step back a bit to put some space between her and them. Something that, of course, didn't go unnoticed by the inhabitants, and especially by the still kneeling woman. So she extended her hand and said something that was clearly meant to reassure Circe, not that she could understand her. But whatever she had said had the opposite effect on Circe, because as soon as the woman opened her mouth, she began to move her from side to side so quickly that she created after images, making it look like she had 4 heads each, wearing a different expression, and each speaking with a different voice at the same time. It was understandably quite a disturbing sight, so Circe was rather happy when her attention was drawn towards what seemed to be a pitch-black snowflake that lazy fell from the sky to land directly on the woman's head, to be directly absorbed by her, causing Circe to look up at the sky to see many more of these snowflakes made from the same energy that was inside the inhabitants, all seemingly heading straight for one of the inhabitants. But before Circe had a chance to even think about what she was seeing right now, her attention was pulled back towards one of the inhabitants that were standing around her, because he had started to sing Maledictus, and as soon as he had finished, all the women in the crowd sang Domun Libas. Circe just watched as the inhabitants continued to sing the creepiest song she had ever heard, until all of them raised their arms above their head and looked to the sky while singing Mater Sanguine, causing Circe to follow their gaze. At first she was confused because it looked like night had rolled in without her noticing, but then the stars began to move, rearranging themselves to form what was clearly a iris and pupil, making her realize that she wasn't looking at the night sky, but instead straight into a gigantic jet-black eye that she knew without a shadow of a doubt was looking right at her, never in her. Admittedly short, life had Circe been as scared as at that very moment, leaving her completely unable to move even a singular muscle, until the headache returned just painful enough to make her lower her head and thusly notice that the shadows of the inhabitants were slowly creeping towards her. Still scared out of her mind, Circe took a step back, causing multiple pairs of claw-like hands made of pure darkness to grow out of the shadows, slowly reaching for her and making her headache ever worse the closer they got to her. Circe reacted to this like most people would have. She stumbled a few steps back to get away from them, but they just kept moving towards her, and even worse, ever more of them began to spawn from the shadows besides her, slowly encircling her. So, with her only means of escape slowly disappearing, Circe decided to make a run for the portal before they could fully encircle her. But as soon as she turned around and ran towards the portal, she heard someone roar behind her, quickly followed by the sound of people running after her. She didn't really have to turn around to know that the inhabitants were after her, but she did it anyway, her curiosity too strong for her to resist. And when she did, she saw that it was indeed the inhabitants that were after her, just like she had been somewhat expecting. What she hadn't expected was that were running after her on all fours like animals, or running on the walls like others would run on the ground. However, the important thing she noticed that they were gaining on her rather quickly. So she quickly pulled one of the flash stones she had brought along for a situation like this and quickly tossed it over her shoulder. The stone shattered on the floor and then released a blinding flash of light. Caught completely off guard, none of the inhabitants seemingly managed to shield their eyes before the flash temporarily blinded them, causing them to trip and fall over one another, or by the sound of it, over some of the containers. But that only stopped them for a few moments, before they were back on their feet and charging right at her. Thankfully, those few moments were all that Circe needed to reach the gate and jump through it. Once more she could taste the color purple before she reached the room where her little journey had began, and as soon as she did, she fell on her knees out of sheer exhaustion. But despite that exhaustion, her mind still tried feverishly to make sense out of what she had seen. So engrossed was she in fact in her own thoughts that didn't even notice her parents and grandmother calling out to her before running towards her. Only when her father grabbed her shoulders and asked what happened did Circe manage to snap back to reality. However, her thoughts were still way too much of a mess for her to answer that question. So she tried to calm herself and her thoughts down a bit by going through her memories of what had happened before she answered her father. But whenever she tried to remember something that had happened on the other side of the gate, something pulled the memory from her grasp, making her look inside her mind to find that something was really inside of it. Something that clearly wanted her to notice their presence, because as soon as Circe noticed a picture of a giant gray-skinned, scar-covered muscular woman holding her finger to her lips in a shush gesture appeared in her mind. Circe didn't need to ask who she was or what she wanted, because she had the same eyes as her children. So she just quietly agreed to keep her mouth shut, and once Circe had, she made Circe say there was nothing on the other side of the gate but darkness and stars. I'm not even sure there was any ground there to stand on, because as soon as I was on the other side, I immediately began to just kind of float around. Thankfully, it wasn't hard to find the gate thanks to the gate stone after I managed to find a way to move around by taking control of her voice. This somewhat unsurprisingly rather shocked both her parents and grandmother, even causing her mother to ask, "Are you sure?" Only to receive a slap on the back of the head from Circe's grandmother for asking such a rather stupid question before she walked to the gate and then poked her head through. When Circe's grandmother pulled her head out of the gate, she simply turned to them and said, "There is really nothing there but the void out there. Whatever was once on the other side of this gate is long gone. Thank goodness your father gave you some enchanted clothes just in case this happens, or you would have been dead. But sadly, that's just part of the job, though I had hoped that this was something you would have never have to experience yourself, especially not on your first mission. Which is my fault. I really should have checked where the gate leads to before sending you through." However, Circe just shook her head and said, "It's all right, Grandma, it wasn't as bad as you think. Honestly, floating around was rather fun until my air supply got low." Meaning every word of it, because at this point, her memories of what had really happened had already been replaced with memories of her floating through the void. The only thing that remained from what had really happened on that day every time she remembered that story, even on her deathbed, was the all too familiar feeling of wrongness. Thanks for diving into this story with me. Don't miss out on the next one. Hit that subscribe button, give this video a big thumbs up, and drop a comment below with your thoughts. I'd love to hear what you think.